Hello, everyone. Just a quick check. Can you hear me? Can you confirm, please?
Okay, perfect. So they are.
Good afternoon. Just to say that we will start a few minutes late because we're still working on technical problems relating to the live streaming and the online participants. So I'll wait for a signal and then kick off then. In the meantime, please show some patience. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask you to take your seats and we will begin. I am very pleased to welcome you all to this session on aligning financial flows with SDG 14 and 15, which, as you probably know, are the most explicitly environmental of the SDGs, and reflect a growing interest in the nature agenda and the link between nature and finance. I think that having a session on this at Building Bridges Week is highly appropriate, and I think reflects something that we're seeing throughout our society and throughout the debates around sustainable finance. The session is co-organized by the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, the UNEP Finance Initiative, and WWF Switzerland, and I thank them for the work that they've done in preparing this session. As you know, we also have online participants. It's being live streamed so that I hope that we will also have participation in the discussions, questions and answers later from those audiences that are online. Let me just say a few words before I introduce the speakers, who I now see on the screen, or briefly saw on the screen, and just about the context in which this debate is happening. The first thing I'd like to say is that anybody who follows sustainable finance will have noted that the whole concept, the whole priority of addressing nature finance has come very, very rapidly up the international agenda. It used to be that when we talked about sustainable finance, we were talking largely about climate finance. But just in the past 2 years, nature finance has become a topic in its own right, and one that is attracting a great deal of attention. Of course, we've also learned that there's an enormous convergence between the climate finance agenda and the nature finance agenda, and that addressing climate priorities through nature action is extremely important, and vice versa. And we are moving to a point where we don't see nature simply as a potential carbon sink, but as a source of capital, a source of investment, a source of wealth, and a source of planetary stability. Not long ago, the administrator of UNDP was in town, and he gave a talk at a dinner that Patrick Audier organized, where he said, you know, when you talk about the SDGs in the context of finance, it's important to think of SDGs not as moral imperatives, but as areas of risk. And that the breakdown of natural resources and ecosystem services on land and in the water is increasingly perceived as a risk for the financial system, for investors, and for financial institutions. In the past, we used to think that, oh, nature finance, that means how do we get more money into the priorities designated by the Convention on Biological Diversity, into other nature priorities, into protected areas. And of course, we still need to do that. We still need to increase the flow. But it's also important to ensure that there is a far better alignment between the priorities of nature and the way in which financial systems work, and in particular, the way in which finance and investment flows. So we're talking about risk, but we're talking about new forms of risk as well. The risk of companies that are nature dependent suffering increased risk from the breakdown of natural resources. But we're also increasingly looking at the impact on nature and natural resources of company activities and of financial activity. And we are moving, I think, rather quickly towards the notion that in the field of nature, we need something equivalent to net zero. We need a kind of principle of nature positive action, nature positive finance that will become slowly, or rather, I hope quickly, a real obligation of performing in this area. So to introduce the session today, we have 5 speakers. We have 4 who will give presentations and 1 who will join the panel discussion that follows it. We have 3 of them online here, and I welcome them. I'm sorry you're not here to share the occasion with us. We have Jessica Smith from UNEP FI. We have Oliver Schelske here from Swiss Re Institute, Faye Reinhardt here from WWF Switzerland, Alina Donetz online as well from Lombard-Odier, and Christophe Baumann from the State Secretariat for International Finance, who will join us for the panel discussion. What we would like to do is to underline two things. One, not only, of course, the important link between the way finance works and nature priorities, but also the fact that we've arrived at a time where there is really an extraordinary opportunity to move not through developing new thinking, not through developing, gathering and analyzing new data, but that there are possibilities to improve the situation that are available now, that there are instruments and approaches being developed that financial institutions can use now without waiting for further development and further data gathering and analysis. So our message here is going to be, you don't need to wait. Stuff is urgent, and you can act on it now. So the first presentation will be shared by Jessica Smith, who is the nature lead in the UNEP Finance Initiative based in Geneva, and Oliver Schelsky, the Director of Natural Assets and ESG Research in the Swiss Re Institute. I'm sure you all know Swiss Re as a global player in the assessment of risks related to the environment and climate and many other things. And I would like to invite you now. Is it Jessica starting, or is it you?
Jessica.
Jessica, please, you'll start, and then Oliver will take over. And I hope we've managed to put your slides up on the screen. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, although I'm normally based in Geneva, unfortunately, I had to travel at late notice. So I'm not able to join you there today in person, but thank you for bringing me in this hybrid format. We're absolutely thrilled to be one of the co-organizers of this event, and for me to share the panel with our illustrious speakers here. The topic of aligning financial flows with SDG 14 and 15 is really at the heart of the work that we're doing at UNEP-FI. So we work with banks, investors, and insurers to mainstream nature right into the heart of the financial sector. And we run platforms like the Principles for Responsible Banking, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and we work with the leaders amongst the 4,000 members of the Principles for Responsible Investment. And the concept of alignment of financial flows is really much more understood in the climate space. So I think many of you will be aware of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and the platforms within that are supported by UNEP-FI and other partners, which was shifting, announced at Glasgow, shifting 130 trillion of capital towards the transition and aligning that with a 1.5 degree scenario. So we're hoping within the coming months to be able to really accelerate this kind of alignment for nature and biodiversity. We hope that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be agreed next year and will give a clear signal to the market to shift finance the way that it has for the climate space. But really for more than 10 years, we've been working with our members on targets, metrics, risk, and disclosure. Just on the topic of disclosure, many of you will be familiar with the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. And UNEP-FI have been working with UNDP, WWF, and Global Canopy over the past year to set up the task force on nature-related financial disclosure. So again, we hope this is another moment that will accelerate the understanding of nature-related risk and both financial and environmental materiality in this space. So in terms of some of the risks, there are certainly physical risks like loss of production due to coastal flooding, legal and regulatory risks like non-compliance of companies coming, when there's new regulations. We are now starting to see examples of stranded asset type risks from lawsuits that are emerging. There's market risk like changes in consumer preference, and the Harvard Business Review had a very interesting study recently showing that 90% of the fastest growing companies are marketing their products as sustainable. And further one is reputational risks, like those arising from the way a company's nature-related performance is perceived by stakeholders. So on the risk side, there's a very clear case to act on nature from the financial perspective. And we also see that the upside opportunities are growing. Just recently, we identified more than 38 new products that came to market on the biodiversity finance side. And many of those in the room will be involved in some of those. But I wanted to focus my remarks today around Encore, which is one of the cutting edge frameworks and tools that allows the financial sector to identify and manage their biodiversity and nature related risks and impacts. So if we can go on to the next slide. Encore stands for Exploring Natural Capital Opportunities, Risks, and Exposures. And this is initially a web-based tool that was launched in 2018. And it was really the first of its kind to synthesize a large body of literature on potential natural capital dependencies and impacts of all economic activities. We developed Encore both as a framework, a tool, and a knowledge base within the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. That's partnering with Global Canopy and UNEP WCMC. We've had support initially from the Swiss development agency SECO and the MABA Foundation, and I'll come back to another spin-out product that has been supported by PHONE. So this is really has been developed as a tool for a financial sector audience, but it can help a variety of different stakeholders understand how do businesses depend and impact on nature, how does environmental change affect dependencies, and what can be measured to gain insight on nature-related risks. So as you can imagine, this is very useful information for the direction that Mark outlined that we're heading. And we found that the Encore framework and data set has been foundational in many of the recent developments in the nature and finance space, including being widely referred to in the Dasgupta review, underpinning major analyses by the World Economic Forum, and central bank assessment of biodiversity risk at a systemic scale. So just one example is that WEF used Encore data to show that more than half the world's economic output, 44 trillion USD of economic value generation, is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. So understanding of dependencies is increasing. And if we can go on to the next slide, we really see this as a dynamic relationship between impacts, dependencies, and financial materiality. So we've seen in the TNFD proposed technical scope that there is language around evolving nature-related risks. And this is really signaling the importance of understanding impacts and dependencies and how those can become financial materiality. So this is quite consistent with the approach of TCFDs to financial materiality that extends, beyond immediate risks to consider transition risks, for example, through the use of scenarios. And it also reflects the direction of emerging debate and practice across financial institutions and regulators. I think particularly interesting here is the direction of EU regulation, and we're expecting, new EU guidance on disclosure of biodiversity in corporate standards. So, there's a lot of movement in this direction in the EU regulatory and standard space, but also other jurisdictions. So this is an interesting relationship between these elements, and the approach that the TNFD is planning to take, and a framework that will be released in beta shortly and refined over the coming year and consulted on and hopefully finalized by 2023 is to mitigate risk to the organization or outside in, including risks associated with its impact on nature, so inside out. So this is a sort of nuanced approach to double materiality, and it's similar to other approaches to materiality that have been promoted by the WEF and others. So I think if we can go on to the next slide, as I mentioned, Encore itself has been on the market since 2018 and has been, very widely used, and we're extremely proud of it. With the support of PHONE, the Natural Capital Finance Alliance has been able to develop a new biodiversity module. And this is a tool within Encore that helps aligning financial portfolios with biodiversity goals. So this tool focuses initially on the agriculture and mining sectors as key sectors driving biodiversity loss globally. It calculates metrics of species extinction and ecological integrity risk of agricultural land occupation and mining assets associated with the financial portfolio input by a user. And it aggregates these metrics to portfolio level exposure indicators. It presents future sector level scenarios and associated biodiversity impacts, and provides guidance on engagement strategies to contribute to biodiversity goals. So this biodiversity module has been released as a kind of beta and to get further feedback from the market. So we've already had 30 financial institutions, including Swiss Re on the panel with me, who've been participating in a testing group to make sure that this is aligned to the needs of the market. You know, handing over to Oliver shortly, you know, we see this as a really practical tool in transitioning to a nature positive future. We will continue to update the tool, and significantly, as I mentioned, with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework expected in May of next year, we will continue to update the tool to align with the global biodiversity goals. At the moment, it's helping to align very generally to SDG 14 and 15, which we think is important in the interim, but it will be helpful to really align finance. You know, we have seen that the Article 2.1c in the Paris Agreement has been very catalytic, and we are expecting to see some similarly catalytic language in terms of the goals and targets of the next Global Biodiversity Framework. So I wanted to really thank FON for supporting the development of this biodiversity module, and you know, we'll continue to update it based on feedback and the changes in the policy space. But I've introduced it now, and I'd like to hand over to Oliver, who, as I mentioned, was in our testing group for the biodiversity module, and Swiss Re has been a really active user of the biodiversity and ecosystem services data in the Encore tool itself. So I hope I've given a good quick introduction, and handing over to Oliver now.
Thanks, Jessica. Many thanks for the handover, and on behalf of Swiss Re, many thanks to all of the organizers for the kind invitation, to you, Jessica, and to Juliette for organizing it that kindly. It's an honor to be here with you today. Yeah, and I start straight away taking over from Jessica. Next slide, please. So what is nature in insurance? The slide that I'm seeing here represents as how we look at that today. So a lot of that has been driven from group risk management, group asset management, and group underwriting. Swiss Re Institute is in group underwriting. And you see both sides. It's about exclusion and it's about inclusion. So what we have since roughly 2009 is a sustainable business risk framework, and that is applied to each and every transaction that we are doing. So being it an investment or being it a project that we underwrite. It's a referral tool, and it's mandatory. It has an umbrella policy on the environment and on human rights, and it has certain sectoral policies. You see that on the left-hand side, sectors that are close to nature, that depend on nature, like forestry. So what is the umbrella policy? The umbrella policy is that we do not do any business that harms in World Heritage Sites, UNESCO, that harms in IUCN National Park Category 1 to 4, that harms any Ramsar wetland area, any high carbon forest, any high conservation value forest, or anything in regard to the IUCN Red List. And there is more in the umbrella policy in there, also on the rights of indigenous people who live in that area, of course. Maybe a quick view into the forestry policy. So forestry policy says that we do not do any business that violates local, national, or international law, and do not do any business with, let's say, forest timber producers if they are not adhere to the famous labels, which is FSC, PEFC, and beyond these labels. That's the left-hand side. Right-hand side is about inclusion. So what we see, and my colleagues from risk management presented this last year with UNEP on a session on the sustainability goals, we see that more and more people in any sector report how do they adhere, how do they contribute to the SDGs. And we see, yeah, we want to try to measure this. We call this ISDGs. What is our contribution with our projects to the SDGs? Also, and we can also come to that in the discussion, if one looks at nature is not only about assessing the risk. So insurance is an enabler. Insurance provides a financial protection mechanism and financial umbrella for investments that are being undertaken in nature, like we have the Green Deal. A lot of investments will go. And the colleagues in our public sector team, that is a team that does business with governments, protects governments, had two, I would say, innovative deals. So one was recently on a dike in the Netherlands, Texel, Prince Hendrik dike, aging infrastructure, an old dike, they need to renew it. And Swiss Re provided all construction risks. This is against delay, missing material, X, Y, Z. And the Dutch, as they are so experienced with building the dikes, they did this Prince Hendrik dike as a green dike. So they put sand, they planted millions of grasses, marron grasses, such that the dike won an award for being the greenest dike by a Dutch NGO, Network for Grüne Offices. Asset management, last but not least, Swiss Re is strong there, but I think the colleague from Lombard will go into more detail, so I'll be very short here. Systematic investments, right? So for example, green real estate, Swiss Re has 1.6 billion or 260,000 square kilometers on green offices, and that's not just about green energy, renewable energy, it's really with green roofs and others in there. But why I'm here today? So as Jessica said, Swiss Re also did an ecosystem service index that assesses the state of ecosystem services, nature contribution to people, in the concept of the IPBES for all square kilometers on Earth, and match this with the Encore dependency data. And that's part of the next slide already, please. So this is what we did. We looked at scientific papers that cross Earth, comprehensively comparable, build up the state of nature contribution to people. You see that on the left-hand side from habitat intactness. So how intact is the habitat as of today compared to previous states, taking into consideration the, let's say, disturbances that it received. It's a Newbold paper. I can quote the scientist, of course. And then we looked at the contribution of wild pollinators, the contribution of nature for local air and climate regulation, cleaning the air, cleaning pollutants, water security, water quality, and coastal protection. This is important for insurance because the coral reef protects the coast. One can say that the upper meter of an intact coral reef can absorb 97% of the wave energy if there is a strong hurricane. And that was the other deal that our public sector team did. So in Mexico, they insured the coral reef against the hurricane and insured, of course, the property of the coast. And the payout that comes is earmarked. So it is used to clean the coral. In the middle, you see the state of these ecosystem services from very low to very high on everything on Earth. And on the right-hand side, we aggregated this such that you see in all these different countries what is the state. How much ecosystem service capacity is very low to very high. Almost the last slide, please. This is now the Encore data. So we access the Encore data on dependency, bridge this to the ecosystem services, so such that we see left-hand side 15-sector economic model, no-brainer, agriculture, forestry, fishing depends most, but also other sectors depend. Mining, quarrying, manufacturing, especially because of the water manufacturing needs. And on the right-hand side, we bridge then the Encore dependency data with GDP data from Oxford Economics, a decomposition of a country's GDP. That's the dark arrow. It shows you here for Switzerland what's the contribution of manufacturing to GDP and so on. But the lighter bar shows you this in connection to the dependency on the ecosystem services. And of course, the agri sector in Switzerland for the GDP, not that much importance for the GDP. Talk food security, it's another issue. Talk a diverse menu, it's another issue. But just if you remain in GDP categories, we see the role, the important role of manufacturing or real estate professional services having here being dependent on nature for the GDP. Last slide, please. Yeah, these are the key numbers. So aggregating everything from the square kilometer to the country, we see 39 of 195 sovereign states have ecosystem services providing only very low capacity on 30% of the land, but there are 30 countries where it is very high. This just tells us we do not live in paradise. We have to sustainably use the resources that we use for economic production to maintain the economy to thrive. And the very last slide, is a bit the history Swiss Re looking at nature. As Jessica pointed out, Swiss Re is part of UNEP PSI, PRI. The future is TNFD, so Swiss Re joined TNFD with 35 other companies. So it tells you a bit of actions, of publications, but we have room in the discussion. With that, handing over. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Oliver. Fascinating presentation. I mean, I think it establishes very clearly that those who wish to take nature into greater account in their operations have ways of doing this. And I won't generate any discussion now simply because we're running a little bit late, but I will warn you that I will come back to this. You've made the case why nature risk is so central to business models and business purpose, and you've made the case that there are tools available that will allow you to assess that your risk and the risk of dependency. And so my question will be, and you have time to reflect on it, why isn't it being picked up more readily? Why isn't this absolutely routine in both corporate and financial operations? So I'll leave that with you now and turn to Faye Reinhardt. Faye is a specialist in sustainable finance at WWF Switzerland, and I think all of you who live in this country know how active WWF Switzerland is. WWF is working on aspects of biodiversity risk for finance, in particular the role of regulation and supervision. But Faye will talk to us about WWF's novel approach for measuring biodiversity-related risks. So over to you, Faye.
Many thanks, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and many thanks to the Forum for inviting us to be part of this great event. So, biodiversity, put simply, is the variety of all life on Earth. It is essential for the ecosystems, and which in turn are essential for the ecosystem services on which we all rely on. Next slide, please. But it's also crucial for the economy. According to estimates done by the World Economic Forum, $44 trillion of economic value generation depend moderately or highly on nature. This is more than 50% of the total GDP. Yet, biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate. According to the latest Living Planet report, world wildlife population decreased by 68% on average since the 1970s. In addition, biodiversity and climate change mutually reinforce each other. On the one hand side, climate change is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss. On the other hand, biodiversity loss decreases nature's capacity to sequester carbon, which in turn accelerates climate change. As a result, the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity loss as the third most impactful risk facing the global economy and the fourth most likely to occur. Next slide, please. As with climate-related risks, biodiversity-related financial risk can be divided into 4 categories. The first category, the physical risk, or also sometimes called the dependency risk, arise from reductions in the quality and quantity of services provided by the ecosystems. For example, a decrease in animal pollination can yield to a reduction in the yields of food crops. The second category, transition risks, arise from actions undertaken to mitigate or combat biodiversity loss. This especially puts companies at risk that have high negative impacts on biodiversity, as for example, companies that are operating in the agricultural or forestry sector. The third category, litigation risks, arise from litigation actions undertaken against companies that are held responsible for the occurrence of physical and transition-related risks. Last but not least, biodiversity loss also represents a systemic risk with nonlinear consequences and tipping points. All these risks have the potential to create negative financial impacts for companies as well as financial institutions. That's why it's crucial for financial institutions to address, assess, and manage biodiversity-related risks, as well as their impacts they have on biodiversity. Next slide, please. But not just financial institutions have an important role to play. Also, central banks and supervisory authorities have a key role in addressing biodiversity-related risks, and also steering financial flows towards the alignment with environmental objectives. They are indeed in a unique position to influence the lending and investment practices of financial institutions, as well as their disclosure practices. For this, they have various means at stake. For example, they can set expectations around the governance or risk management processes. They can impose specific disclosure requirements or set differentiated capital requirements, to just name a few. In addition to this, also the central bank's activities can lead to biodiversity loss or even hinder the transition of the sustainable financial system towards more sustainability, as they have become themselves big investors in the market. However, it is their mandate to mitigate risk ex ante. That means they have to mitigate the risk before they occur. Given the urgency to act and the cost of inaction, central banks and financial supervisory authorities should take action right now and follow a precautionary approach. We at WWF Sustainable Finance Department are here to support financial institutions as well as central banks and supervisory authorities in addressing those risks. That's why I would like now to highlight two of the current projects that we are working on. Next slide, please. The first one is the biodiversity risk method for investors. There we aim to develop a methodology that allows financial institutions to address the biodiversity-related risk within their listed equity and corporate bond portfolio. For this, we covered the three first risk categories with a special focus on physical or dependency-related risks. We came to the idea to do this project because our initial stock take showed that especially company-specific solutions are still missing. So therefore, we want to bring the great work of what was done within the Encore tool down to the company level so that financial institutions can differentiate between front runners and laggards. In addition to the methodology, we will also produce a first pilot tool that will be tested with the financial institutions that are part of this project so that we can refine the methodology afterwards and tailor it towards the need of the financial institutions. Next slide, please. The second project I would like to highlight is the Sustainable Financial Regulation and Central Bank Action Tracker, or short, the SUSREC tracker. It is an interactive online tool that assesses how central banks, regulators, and supervisory authorities integrate climate and biodiversity considerations within their core businesses. The first annual assessment of the SUSREC tracker showed that there is an increasing awareness of biodiversity and climate-related issues within the central banks, and that they started to address those issues. However, the tracker also showed that central banks, or not many central banks, currently use the tools they have, the regulatory, the monetary, or prudential tools, to incentivize the financial institutions to go away from harmful activities towards activities that restore and conserve nature. With this, I'm at the end of this super short presentation, and I'm super happy to answer all your questions. If you go to the next slide, you can also see our contact details. Maud Abdelli, my colleague, unfortunately cannot be here today, but she's responsible for the Greening Financial Regulation, which aims to encourage and help central banks and supervisory authorities to address biodiversity-related issues, which also covers the suspect tracker. And if you have specific questions about the Biodiversity Risk Project, please feel free to send me a mail. I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Faye. I hope we will get some questions at the end of this session as well. Very interesting presentation and really fascinating work. And I think it's very complementary with what Encore does, providing the sort of framework for understanding risk and moving towards a stage where we can manage it. You mentioned something very quickly, and of course time didn't permit you to elaborate, but you mentioned the potential for restoration. We tend to think of building biodiversity considerations into financial decision-making as a way of avoiding harm and thereby lowering risk. But in fact, there's a potential out there. There's the positive side of the story that so much of nature could be restored to productivity and biodiversity at the same time. So I'll come back to that in the discussion and allow you to think about it in the meantime. So our next speaker is Alina Donets, who's a portfolio manager at Lombard-Odier Investment Managers in the Global Equities Division. So Alina, you and Lombard-Odier actually make investments and take these investment decisions. And so I'd be very interested to hear from you how you are building the sorts of considerations we've seen illustrated here, the sorts of risks that need to be managed into your day-to-day operations. Over to you, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me, and apologies from my side as well for not being able to be there in person. Unfortunately, it seems that the pandemic doesn't give up just yet. I'm actually very glad to hear that there is more discussion about the wider array of environmental challenges. We've recently spent a lot of time talking about climate change and introducing this into global agenda, but we haven't really talked about this web of environmental and eventually social challenges. And I think a role of asset managers and investors like ourselves at Lombard-Odier is very important here because we are the decision makers who are allocating the capital and moving capital towards the solutions and potentially away from the risks as well. And so we have an important role in kind of creating the new ecosystems and creating the new structures in the economic and social policies and states. And equally, it's also very important to find ways how we can do this without necessarily harming the financial returns. So starting on slide 3 and coming back to this SDG 14 and 15, the life on land and in water, health of the ecosystems is really at the heart of our environmental and eventually economic challenge. We believe that our economy has gone what we call wild. It's expressing the characteristics that are adding pressure to the land and to the water ecosystems and the resources. The economy is wasteful in using the natural resources. It suffers from idle capacities. It has a dirty footprint. It's highly pollutive. And also in contribution with, or in combination, all of these factors lead to a lot of inequalities in the lopsided society. So it turns out that actually climate change stemming from the carbon emissions is only one part of the ecological challenges that are created as a result and as a reason for this environmental issues. And on slide 4, we are actually leaning a lot on the planetary boundaries concept because we believe that this concept really helps to understand the interaction between different ecological and environmental issues, their interrelations, and then also eventually help us to develop the approach that will be looking at both the risks and the opportunities when it comes to the environment, and especially when it comes to the balance in the ecosystems and the living organisms. So when we're looking at the pressures that have been created on the Earth, we define the health of the ecosystems by biodiversity. And actually, biodiversity is at the center of all of the planetary boundaries. It is one of the issues that we are harming today, but it's also highly related to other boundaries and to other parameters that we use in assessing the health of the planet and the health of our ecological systems. when it comes to the pressure on biodiversity, it is not only something that is highly measurable. I think we lost actually some of the slides. Are we able to move across the slides?
No, the slides have just come up, so I hope that we're able to move through them now. Which slide should we be on now?
Slide 5, if we can move to the slide 5 now.
Can we move to slide 5, please? Let me assure the participants that we will make these slides available on the website after so even if we haven't seen all of them as you intended, they will be available. So please continue.
So when it comes to the pressure on biodiversity, it's not only measurable from the environmental perspective, which shows already staggering statistics, but it also translates into economic risks. And the economic risks are eventually creating opportunities for investments. And I think I also want to maybe highlight this point, and I've heard a lot of different approaches through the presentations just before me. We actually, from our perspective at Lombard Odier, we're not only focusing on the risk side, we're actually talking about attractive opportunities. And I think it's a very important point to pause at and to think about very clearly, because without understanding that there are opportunities in shifting our economic and social systems, that these opportunities will eventually lead to enhanced economic returns. Without this understanding, we will never have the most or the majority of the market and the majority of the capital being allocated towards the right solutions. When we're talking only about mitigating risks, it is important, but it's also lacking that incentivization, that motivation to continuously increasing the allocation of the resources of the capital towards the solutions that help to resolve the ecological challenges. Now, going on to the next slide, the good news is that, no, can we come back to the slide 6, please? The good news is that coming away from the wild economy, we believe that there is an opportunity for us to transition to an economy that we called click. It's an economy that is circular, it's lean, it's socially inclusive, and it's also clean from a perspective of the externalities that it creates. Essentially, we're looking to address all of the missteps of the current economic system. And as such, as I mentioned before, this new click economy will not be only beneficial from the ecological or environmental perspective, but it will be beneficial from the economic perspective. And again, coming back to where I started with, the role of investors here is to helping to restore and balance the essentials of our economy. And eventually, as asset allocators and investment decision makers, it is in our hands to help shape the economy and also shape the pace with which we transition to the new economic model. So now moving on to slide 8, we have worked on translating these issues into the investment context with a clear idea in mind. Aside to managing the risks that emerge as a result of the challenges, we also need to aim to capture the opportunities that emerge from the transition and help to accelerate the transition. So now we're starting to think about what are the strategies, what are the investment funds that we can create that will be addressing the key challenges. We started with a climate transition fund back at the beginning of last year, really addressing the key challenges from the climate and carbon related perspective. And eventually we also moved into launching the natural capital fund that is actually addressing the challenges that are not related necessarily to carbon, even though they would be indirectly linked, but specifically focusing on developing the solutions for lean industrial processes that help to preserve the natural resources. And then equally also develop the circular bioeconomy that will be actually harnessing the nature and supporting the development and supporting the life of the ecosystems in itself. So how did we do it? On next slide, the strategy was developed based primarily on a thematic screening approach, where we have been working very diligently with our internal multidisciplinary sustainability team in cooperation also with Systemic, with Oxford University, that were integrated into this discussions and the development for the verification of the thematics. And as you can see on this slide, we have really within the circularity and lean industrial processes, we have zoomed into the challenges and the solutions that we think need to be supported by financing, eventually identifying the companies that are developing the technologies that help to establish these goals or achieve these goals. So the first part to our work is really identifying who are or what are the companies that need to achieve and need to access the financing and access the capital in order to develop and or in order to unlock the transition in the first place. And that focus also enables us to prove the point that I have been also trying to highlight throughout my presentation, is that you can invest in companies that are developing these solutions and achieve excess economic returns, excess financial returns in their strategies, which is an important point that is eventually continuously attracting more capital into our strategy, into similar strategies, and eventually translating into financing of the solutions and financing of the companies that require this capital. Eventually, we are also obviously looking to develop the metrics that will help us to quantify the environmental achievements. So on the next slide, we're actually going back to this idea of using planetary boundaries as the foundation of these investments. Today, we have already developed an internal tool for climate change related issues. It is a forward-looking tool that looks at the assessment of the temperature alignment of the companies, and eventually also the value at risk from the investments in these companies. So really translating the current state of the carbon emissions of the companies, looking at their future emissions and the trajectory that they're setting themselves up to ensure that going forward, they will be meeting the required decarbonization, and then eventually trying to price it from the financial perspective. Our goal is to develop very similar tools for assessment for all other planetary boundaries. So we are currently internally working on developing the tools that will assess, that will help us to assess the contributions to the water footprint, the contributions to the improvement of the pollution from the main pollutants, and also the preservation of biodiversity or potential exposures to the biodiversity risk as well. Now, we do that in combination of the assessment of the footprint of the companies, meaning looking at the practices and the operations of the companies and how well are these aligned with the objectives that we have put forward, but then equally integrating into the analysis the activities of the companies, what type of technologies they're developing, and whether these technologies have a positive contribution to achieving, for example, the goals of reducing the pressure on water resources, whether it's neutral, or whether that the activities, the products and the services are actually harmful on the other side. So in combination in combination of all of these metrics, we will be able to not only direct the capital towards the companies that are involved in the activities, involved in the production of products and services that are highly contributive, but eventually, hopefully, also to assess what is the environmental opportunity and environmental improvement that these companies can provide. So I'll stop here. I'll make it very short, and I'll obviously be looking forward to address any of the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of this in the panel, but it's a very interesting example of how you take these principles and actually build them into the operations of a financial institution and some of the additional challenges that you face in having to do that. I particularly note that you underline the importance of the social dimension of everything that we do, and that is something that sometimes in our world of nature and biodiversity is underplayed, and I think it's underplayed to our discredit, and I think it's something that we all have to grapple with. The other thing that you underlined, I think, is very important, is that if you're in an investment company, the expectations and the requirements of your investors have to be looked after carefully. And so the challenge is, can you do that while restoring the earth, while maintaining the integrity of ecosystems? So thanks for those. I think we have an excellent foundation to move forward on. I'll move forward to the panel discussion now, where I will invite the different presenters to discuss and answer questions. But we have with us, I hope, on the screen soon, Christoph Baumann, who's the Deputy Head of Insurance and Sustainable Finance at the Swiss State Secretariat for International Finance. Christoph, I hope you have had an opportunity to listen to these presentations and to be as impressed as I am with the progress that's being made at a very practical level in aligning finance with the needs of nature conservation and restoration. What is your sense, listening to this from the perspective of a government who has to put in place the sort of framework within which all of this financial activity and this attempts to address nature need to fit? How do you see the state of play in terms of addressing the challenges that are out there? Over to you, Christoph.
So thank you very much, and also thank you very much for these insightful interventions from my distinguished colleagues. I think there's various levels of the way of how we look at biodiversity risks and impacts from companies. More on the financial market side, biodiversity risk is a clear risk for the financial sector, and as such, it should already be considered under current fiduciary rules. So under current regulation, it's a fiduciary duty to take into account all relevant risks in portfolio management. That includes climate risks and that includes biodiversity risks. So that might not yet always be the case that's applied, and I think there it needs more awareness building and the more models such as Encore and the more disclosures there are from TNFD side, for instance, the more awareness it creates in the financial market that actually there is a risk. And that's actually a fantastic recognition that there is risks and that the risk is both transition related as well as physical related. And when you minimize the transition risk, you naturally or directly have an impact. You reduce the negative impact on biodiversity. So I think that this financial risk perspective, which is a very egoistic way of looking at it from a bank perspective, actually has as an unintended consequence, a very positive consequence as well. The second thing is disclosures. We really, really need high quality decision-ready disclosures. As such, the TNFD is a fantastic endeavor. Also there, we have just recently put into law disclosure regulation for larger companies across all sectors. So all companies who are listed or financial companies as of 500 employees have to disclose their ESG related risks and impacts. So with a double materiality. Within the area of climate, we go now into much more depth based on the TCFD. On biodiversity, we leave it still a bit more general, but this also leaves it up to the NGOs and to the market itself to say, how do we tackle biodiversity disclosures? And obviously there, as mentioned by previous speakers, the TNFD, we are very hopeful that the TNFD will soon come with its first iteration, which will then hopefully have a similar success as the TCFD in being adopted.
I hope it has a considerably greater success than TCFD, and that it moves much more quickly into the sort of required space than TCFD has done. I think TNFD builds on TCFD so it can learn the lessons from it. Thanks very much for that reaction. I do want to go back to our panelists now, and you've now heard a series of very uplifting presentations about how well we're doing in developing tools and how there's no excuse anymore for investors not to build nature entirely into their operations. I wish reality were quite that optimistic. So let me just start with a I think we know that something south of 10% of all investment follows responsible criteria, impact criteria, and that within that, nature-related investment accounts for something like 3%. So we are, and even if those figures are off by a few percent either way, it still tells us that the reality is not quite as rosy as the potential. So first question I want to ask, maybe Jessica or Oliver, and you choose how you wish to respond to it, is that we know that the risks are there. We know those risks have to be managed. We begin to have the tools to do it. Why isn't the whole field moving faster in that direction than it seems to be? And I would ask you all to make your responses very brief so that we can bring in the others as well, and then the audience in question and answer. So, Jessica, you want to start?
Great. Thanks, Mark. And, I think this is a broader question than the financial sector. I think there's something really in human psychology and culture, going back. And I think the work of Yuval Noah Harari is insightful here in terms of how we've got here as a species. So not only a challenge in the financial sector, but a much broader one. I think when we look at the issue of climate change and how long we had the science in hand and how long it took to, develop strategies and, figure out modalities and metrics to respond, there's suggestions that it's taken us 10 years to come up with 3 numbers, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And the issue of nature is much more diverse, more complex, more pluralistic, many different ways of looking at it. It adds complexity, but I'm actually very optimistic that we can move faster. I think it's a big paradigm shift for the financial sector in the way that we've looked at climate. And, once you look at climate, you immediately start, getting to the issue of nature and biodiversity. It's inevitable, particularly around food systems. And the logic of materiality, it becomes very clear. The other point I'm optimistic on is that nature is much easier for us to connect with as human beings. And I think that there's a lot of positive impact stories. Now, in terms of financial flows, it's true we're really far from where we need to be, and UNEP is now publishing a State of Finance for Nature report annually, and it similarly says we're way behind, and the blended finance tools that we have haven't really been coming to play as fast for nature as they have for climate. But I think we're learning a lot, and I'm feeling that we are accelerating and hopefully leapfrogging what's been done in the climate space. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Oliver.
Thank you. So your answer is partly that we are human and partly that we haven't achieved enough materiality for nature in financial decision making, which I think is evident. But maybe I'll just bounce back to Christoph Baumann and ask, is part of the problem not that we still have in place a whole range of perverse incentives, a whole range of factors that reward financial actors for undermining climate or undermining nature? And isn't it the role of the regulator to sort of systematically identify and seek to eliminate those? And I know, Christoph, that you're active in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, so I'm not particularly talking about Switzerland, but at the international level, do you see a way of progressing, accelerating that trend?
That's a very good question. Thank you. So in general, I think also, as in climate, also in biodiversity, it should be, as far as possible, the polluter pays principle should apply. So when in climate we need a big fat tax on carbon, to use a quote from the former OECD Secretary General, as far as possible we need to do the similar things in biodiversity. I think that what really kickstarted the international dialogue is in climate was the Article 2.1c in Paris Agreement, and I think it's absolutely instrumental that we get a similar article in the CBD, and Switzerland is advocating very strongly towards that in January. So I think this will really increase the awareness also with policymakers, but I'm not 100% optimistic about the entire question about subsidies and that are harming biodiversity, and obviously Switzerland is not innocent in this matter either, as are most industrial countries. The example of subsidies on fossil fuels is not giving me much hope that is a discussion that will progress very far, very quickly on an international forum.
Yes, thank you. Well, we have, of course, organizations like WWF whose purpose is not only analysis and development of new approaches, but also public education and advocacy. And perhaps some of those subsidies remain in place because the movement contesting them or calling for them to be reformed or removed isn't yet strong enough. So I wonder, Faye, whether you see a growth in demand from the general public for levels of performance by corporations and financial actors that guarantee that their impact on climate and biodiversity is not negative. So if we get to a point where, nature positive or net zero is a requirement in the same way as eliminating child labor has been in the past, and so that performing within the limits imposed by nature becomes a sort of requirement for a social license to operate. Do you see that happening?
Yes, no, definitely. I think also the climate change issue really made the people more aware of nature, and also I fully agree with Jessica's comment before that we maybe don't value nature that much, also because the production processes are often so far away that we don't really know that this is all nature that we have or that we use on a daily basis. And I see definitely a shift in the people's mindset, and that they acknowledge that a lot of things that we use on a daily basis is based on nature and is putting nature at risk.
Thanks very much. That's encouraging, and we certainly see it in the climate, and I hope that the sort of this movement aspect of it builds in nature as well. Alina, you work within a bank, a private bank, an asset manager. Do you have an opinion about the sort of how far we can progress with sort of voluntary action and innovation within financial institutions, as opposed to the need for regulation at the national level, but also at the international level? Do you think that we can count on the sort of more advanced financial institutions like Lombard-Odier to sort of set the pace and bring the others behind them, or do you think it's going to require a mix of that and ever tougher regulation? What's your view on that?
I am actually very optimistic. I think that we can achieve that. And when I was listening to Jessica, I was thinking to myself, what are the barriers for us to actually accelerate this transition and really develop the solutions and develop the circumstances under which we're not risking the nature and natural capital, but we're actually also perhaps enhancing it. And I feel that we as asset managers and investment firms are very much responsible for this, because we haven't been early enough or quick enough in developing the solutions, such as, for example, our natural capital fund, that would enable the capital owners to shift the capital towards the right solutions. So we have actually been a huge obstacle in an allocation of this capital. And the reason why I'm saying this is because when we launched the natural capital last year in November, so we've barely achieved a year. It's been a year and 2 weeks. But we're already at almost $1 billion US in assets under management. And that tells you that there is a substantial demand from the capital owners to actually allocate towards the strategies and towards the solutions that will be nature positive, that will be developing those solutions, that will be progressing our economic system in the right direction. The complexity is that we haven't really developed a lot of strategies that would allow us still to maintain the financial diversification for the capital owners, therefore achieving their the fiduciary financial objectives. And B, when we are developing the strategies, very often the strategies that are focusing on these technologies are actually very high risk, and they're not balanced, and they're very difficult to allocate in asset allocations. And I think that there is now an increasing understanding that there is demand for the financial instruments. There is an understanding among the capital owners that the capital should be allocated, and increasingly an understanding that the allocation of this capital will be beneficial from the financial perspective as well. And so now I think we're at the tipping point where we will see more of the investment institutions coming out with the right solutions and really opening the door, opening the gateway to the right investments. So yes, I think it is possible, and regulation is, of course, a highly supportive factor. It is very supportive for our view on how quickly certain technologies will be adapted. But I think that actually the people who own the capital owners, have been far more advanced than the regulators. And the only reason we haven't seen it in capital flows is that they were constrained in their opportunities.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's absolutely right. There is one factor, though, that we've been talking a lot about risk, and you know, in your position, you need to assess risk very carefully and ensure that you've got a broad enough view of risk, including nature-related risk. But the answer you get when you say, well, why isn't more capital flowing into nature-related projects, nature-friendly projects, is that they tend not to meet either the risk or the risk profile or the return expectations of the investors. And of course, you are, I imagine, expected to achieve market level returns in your investments, otherwise your business would suffer. So we sort of had a very good discussion about how we can better manage the whole risk side of this thing. But what about the return side? And perhaps is there evidence that nature-friendly investments are capable of achieving the levels of return within the time frame that investors expect it? We know long-term they can, of course, but in that short time frame. Is there a way out of that, or is that a kind of cage in which you are still bound?
No, there is a way to not only achieve the market returns, but to exceed the market returns. And that is specifically because the transition towards the nature-aligned economy is happening regardless of where we are in the business cycle. So if you are directing the capital towards the solutions that are there to resolve environmental challenges, that are there to bring us closer to the balanced use of nature's own resources, to preserving the ecosystems and preserving the biodiversity, these technologies will be applied whether the economy grows 5% or shrinks 2% next year, because there is a fundamental need to change the shape of our economy. And that means that there is an opportunity to allocate capital towards the technologies that are actually enabling this preservation outcome, that are going to be outperforming the economy, the average economic growth. And so as a result of that, your allocation will actually be associated with higher financial returns. So I don't think it's a matter of trying to achieve market returns. It really is an opportunity to exceed the market returns by the right allocation policy. And luckily enough, with our natural capital fund, we have been able to prove that. We have been outperforming the overall market performance. And we believe this is primarily because we're investing in the right type of technologies that are seeing a huge amount of demand that is driven by the consumer changes, that is driven by regulation, that is driven by the climatic changes that are forcing certain types of investments, and many more.
Yes, thanks very much. And of course, part of the risk side is the risk of being associated with behavior that undermines the planet. It's a reputational risk, but it's also a risk of finding yourself holding assets whose value rapidly plummets. Now, we are here in Switzerland. The audience is much broader than that, particularly the online audience. And so I think it's clear that Switzerland, important as it is, can't turn this ship around on its own. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions about how well we are doing in international cooperation, maybe starting with Christoph again. You know, some people said that COP26 was actually the first climate COP that put nature at the center of its endeavor. And we know that the G7 this year came out with a nature declaration. The multilateral banks chose to make a similar declaration at COP26. G20 has formed the Sustainable Finance Working Group. So you see at the level of international cooperation a much greater interest for sustainable finance in general and for nature finance in particular. Even the different parts of the financial and capital markets are getting together. PRI, of course, UNEP-FI, and its different components are federating, if you like. And so we ought to be generating a great deal of best practice. How well do you think the international system is sort of managing this sort of surge towards a new way of looking at financial responsibility? And are there serious obstacles at the international level in that some players are willing to go quickly while others want to hold back?
Thanks a lot. Maybe start with the first question. I think that I'm quite optimistic. I think it's really important that and the TNFD had the best possible launch, I would say, also from an international perspective with, as you mentioned, the G7 mentioning it was part of, was very prominently at COP26. It was a discussion within the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. Switzerland promoted very strongly within that working group that it's part of the roadmap. So I think it is key that this what TNFD is building is already being prepared that it will flow into the ISSB. So ISSB currently has a climate focus by building up the accounting standards based on the TCFD. It's clear based on the pressure from various governments, including Switzerland, that we want to go beyond climate and that biodiversity is the next topic. It's also clear that TNFD, since it's basically using the same structure of thinking as TCFD, is ideally positioned to be the basis for what ISSB is looking to next. So I think I'm quite optimistic on that side. One challenge the TNFD has that the TCFD didn't is the TCFD was mandated by the FSB, by the Financial Stability Board, and thus by the G20. I think the TNFD still doesn't have that mandate per se, but it has a very strong stewardship group with WWF, UNEP-FI, UNDP, and Global Canopy, and the various countries financially supporting it, like Switzerland, the UK, and France. So I think we have a strong enough coalition to overcome this lack of multilateral mandate and to really make sure that it flows into the ISSB in a year or two. That will be absolutely key to achieve this.
And of course, that immediately translates into the business challenges of an organization like Swiss Re. We tend to think of insurances as organizations that help us manage and deal with risk. But of course, insurance organizations are much more than that. There's the underwriting side, but you're also really massive institutional investors, universal owners. And so if we're going to make a change at the pace and scale we want to, we need to look at where the really large pools of money are and how they're invested against what criteria. So looking at, if you like, the two questions. One is, are you providing leadership as a reinsurance organization to the broader insurance industry on how they should address the challenge of investing their endowments while at the same time advancing towards climate and nature criteria indicators? The second question goes back to something that was said just before, which is that our understanding of the elements of nature that need to be taken into account to build that materiality are not always as advanced as they are in the carbon area, partly because carbon is a very simple indicator that can be used, whereas nature is a great deal more complex. So what's the sort of state of play? We know that Swiss Re is a leader in this field, if not the leader in this field, and are you confident that we are getting to the point where we can address these things at scale?
So a lot is going on that, in a way, is not communicated. That means we have a lot of discussions with investors and shareholders who want to see what is our approach on climate and nature as an exchange, but also as they invest in our stock, as we are relatively high ranked in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and it is a benchmark. So they look at that and they want to know from the top 3, top 5 companies what you do, because they want to keep invested and they want to know it's a good investment. But this is often in one-on-one conversation. It's often learning from each other, exchanging the approaches. So I think there is really a lot going on. And we see that the assets under management, sustainability investments are growing. Also from the investment perspective, yeah, I have to say insurance, that side of the balance sheet, is another business than banking. So a lot of our investments, they are under strict regulatory relations. That means we have to have the capital ready if there comes an accident or a natural catastrophe. It has to be safe. We have to have the liquidity. So a lot is in long-term governmental bonds, where of course we then assess the sustainability of these bonds, but it has to match the liabilities. Second part of the question, this nature element question, and that links me a bit back to Jessica's intro from an insurance perspective. We have to differentiate the nature loss risk into an acute and to a chronic one. And the acute one, casualty insurance, has shown most casualty policies, they insure environmental pollution on the basis of sudden or accidental events. But what we discuss here are slowly emerging risks. They are chronic. But there I'm also confident, looking from the casualty perspective, that the moment there is, let's say, not the one metrics, but more metrics on nature. So you have to look at the species, you have to look at optional values, bequest values, but you have to look also at the ecosystem services. So it needs multidimensional indicators, at least 2, if there will be that number on nature adapted, but maybe there will be 2 or 3. And with these 2 or 3, on a disclosure, it provides data for investors and other stakeholders. Then there is room for maneuver given.
Thank you, Oliver. Do we have questions that have come in from our online audience? I know that we don't have the capacity to have them asked directly online, but if there are, I would be delighted to take them. Otherwise, I'd be happy in the meantime to open the floor to any questions or comments that you would have, having listened to this very fascinating exchange. If you have questions, please raise your hand, identify yourself briefly, and offer your comment. Sebastian at the back.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you as well for the panel. Sebastian Winkler, working 20 years in that sector, started with UNEP FI, and I'm as optimistic as you are, but with a note of caution, because I think we're still very rudimentary in the systems we have set up ourselves, because you're talking on one side planetary boundaries and targets. I'm holding my breath that there will be a target of Article 2.1 like in the biodiversity world. So for me, it's really how do you speed, scale up, and quality. And in the quality side, to me, there is still no access to asset level data. So we have broken out agriculture and extractive as one of the most impacting, as we saw from UNEP. We're working with WWF together on the biodiversity risk side, but there could be at the table people like Christophe to push that disclosure element much stronger, so that asset data is available for analyzing our risks. So that's one question, is on sort of how do you use new technologies, be it geospatial, artificial intelligence, to basically up your game. And the second one is how much do you go for targets? Because I'm rather frustrated to see another zero deforestation commitment coming out of Glasgow, having been in New York in 2014, and I would expect that the private sector to engage and put the mechanisms in of saying we will not invest in net zero. And that's more a question for Big T of saying we've done the climate analysis, what are you doing on forests, and are targets helpful for you to set the agenda? So do you take it upstream of doing sort of your global analysis with that new methodologies, and how much are targets in the lack of regulation useful to push the envelope? So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Sorry, Sébastien mentioned the need for special data, and we know that actually there's very few asset level data, which is really an issue for biodiversity versus climate. I would like to also ask, related to this, to Oliver, how 3.3 is tackling this issue, and how do you implement your environmental risk framework with, you have policies such as World Heritage Site, for instance. You're not going to invest or, insure a company in a World Heritage. How do you know that? Yeah, how do you do it?
It's a very good question. I answer quickly and fast, and also it relates a bit, because insurance business is another business than the investment business, that side of the balance sheet. And by nature, it has been a geographical business right from the very start. So most of these risks are localized. We look at how is a region affected by a risk. We look at the exposure of the property to the hazard, for example. But that's not just all. We look also at the insurance penetration at an area, and we always look at any other risk driver to then price that risk, such that then we have a fairly, let's say, local view. And this is why, for example, we built that map, because we need to have everything in global cross-comparison in order to fit it into our, let's say, corporate risk model. And we also see, finishing one more sentence with the nature, of course, it's on a learning track. How to assess nature, what is the state, and that's crucial, because biodiversity ecosystem service science is traveling in the shadow of climate science. I can say this with good confidence, knowing the professors in both fields from the Swiss universities, for example. So there is more improvement also coming from science with tools, with assessments that will help to have an even better informed view on a lower spatial granularity, because we have the square kilometer, but nowadays it's 30 times 30 meters, for example.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder whether WWF would agree that the nature challenge is merely a local challenge, because if you look at watersheds,
not how I meant it.
Watersheds, rivers, but even the notion of extinction, the loss of the stock of living species, I don't think it could be boiled down to what happens in a 30 by 30 meter grid. And I'm sure you didn't mean that, but the key point you make, and I think it's been made by everybody here, is that we are not as advanced in assessing nature risk and dependency as we are on climate. But I think the other message is that can't and should not be used as an excuse for waiting to take action at a later stage. We will continue refining biodiversity measurement, biodiversity indicators, biodiversity risk measurement, as we will continue doing it in the climate space, which is not perfect either. But I think a key message coming out of this is that we can't afford to say, well, let's come back to this 10 years when the tools are better developed, because all of our science tells us we don't have that time. And so the real challenge, and I think the real encouragement from this session has been to say, you don't need to wait. And there's a great deal you could do right now at every level. So at the level of international cooperation between ministries of finance, at the local level, at the company level, at the investor level. Tools are there and can be fast-tracked, and they would make a considerable difference. So I think it's that's a message of encouragement that I will take from this. Are there any final questions? Yes, please. Go ahead and identify yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you. Riyad Bazia, International Consultancy. Short question to Christophe about the working group. If what you're doing really, if you are you're presenting a report for the G20 summit, or you are also linked directly with the G20 Financial Ministerial Council? Thank you.
So the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is part of the finance track. So it provides the report to the finance ministers and central bank governors group. But it flows into the communique in the end.
But let me add, not only that, but it flows into the sustainable finance roadmap for the G20 that's being developed and has a scope of 5 years. So, what Italy has done with its presidency is to revive the importance of sustainable finance within the G20 context, establish the Sustainable Finance Working Group, Now, there was a green finance study group in the past, but a study group can't make recommendations. So the fact that it's been upgraded to within the finance track to a level where it can make recommendations is quite significant. But probably more than that, that the roadmap that they're developing in the G20 is actually for the whole of the G20. It's not for the finance track, and that working groups in the Sherpa track, like the environmental deputies, are encouraged to dig into things like biodiversity finance and sort of unpack them and develop them to the point where they can be lifted, if you like, into the finance track. I think we are running out of time, so let me close. I want to make 4 remarks in closing, aside from thanking the organizers and the sponsors of Building Bridges Week that have made all of this possible. The first one I already made, which is that there's no excuse not to act now, because the tools that are available permit really significant progress while waiting for others to be developed. I think that there is still the need to address, to find the right balance, the optimal balance between counting on tighter regulation, evolving reformed regulation on the one hand, and the innovation that's happening in the field on the other. I think that we don't have yet a level of dialogue that's sufficient to find that optimal point. But it's clear that we need both regulatory progress and innovation of the sort that we're seeing now in tool development and disclosure, in norms and standards and practices, and all of that I'm confident will go on. I think that an aspect of that, though, is that we need to examine what is undermining progress in the direction that we all clearly wish to move in, and to start really seriously addressing that at the political level and ensuring that our civil society, formulates and articulates a really strong demand for that kind of progress, that destroying nature in the course of financial activity is simply unacceptable and has to be made unacceptable, and that has to translate, therefore, into getting rid of some of the incentives that are currently making that happen. My final point is that I hope that all of this will soon come together in the form of a global standard, a global expectation, which we call nature positive, a frame within which all financial activity will need to come into, so that we are ensured that the great deal of good that finance can do and that investment can do is realized without the cost to the long-term future of the planet. So with that, I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists, present and online, to thank you for your presence, and to promise you that we will continue this debate both in the Building Bridges context and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.